Afternoon and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Saving the Regal Fritillary Butterfly, Current Research and Reintroduction Efforts in Missouri. Today, a panel of presenters will share information about the work they are doing to protect the Queen of the Prairie, the Regal Fritillary Butterfly, an insect of conservation concern in Missouri. Missouri Department of Conservation Natural History Biologist Steve Buback will share natural history and habitat needs of the Regal. Dr. Daniel Marschalek will discuss his current research on population sizes, dispersal abilities, and his mark release project. And Dr. Chris Barnhart will present on his current captive breeding and reintroduction efforts. My name is Erica Van Rinken. I'm the Outreach and Special Projects Coordinator at the Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen. And at the end, the Foundation's Executive Director, Carol David, will read those out to the panelists. Since there are multiple presenters today, please indicate if your question is intended for a particular presenter or for all. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. Steve Buback is a natural history biologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation, a position he has held for 11 years. Prior to this, he earned a bachelor's degree at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, a master's from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and worked for Forest Park Forever in St. Louis, Missouri. He has a particular fondness for rare plants, insects, and ecosystems. And now I'll turn it over to Steve.
All right, thank you, Erica. Thank you for everybody who's tuning in, and thank you especially to my co-presenters. And I guarantee you, if I say anything and they contradict it later, I would listen to them over me. So we're here today to talk about the Regal Fritillary, and it's impossible to talk about the Regal Fritillary without talking about Prairie. Erica referred to it as the Queen of the Prairie, and this is a butterfly species that is obligate on Prairie. We have historic records of this species, just singletons, from large glades and occasionally in the woods and even in urban metropolitan areas, but nowhere does it seem to thrive and reproduce except for on the prairie. This prairie is Cook Meadow down in southwest Missouri. One of the sites that we're going to talk about later is a reintroduction, but Regals seem to need this broad expanse of land, and they seem to need a lot of it. Our latest thinking on it is that they need at least 500 acres of unburned prairie every year in order to have sufficient habitat in which to reproduce. As such, they may act as an umbrella species, and conserving this prairie butterfly may also serve to conserve a lot of other insect life that we don't know nearly as much about. We're fortunate with Regal Fritillaries to know a lot about them, and that's pretty rare for an insect. So let's dive in a little bit to what we know. So basic biology is very similar to a lot of the other butterflies you may be familiar with. They go through the caterpillar and the chrysalis in the adult stage. Unlike the monarch, maybe the most familiar butterfly, fritillaries all lay their eggs in the fall. So those eggs hatch in the fall, and they overwinter as caterpillars. They overwinter as very small caterpillars. Their first instars are only 1 millimeter or 2 long, and they don't feed the entire winter. They just find a little crevice in the soil or tuck into the base of some grasses. And then they wake up as temperatures warm up in the spring, probably once their preferred food source starts greening up. And that's when they start feeding. So we think that this overwintering stage is probably the most vulnerable. The chrysalis on them is not as showy. They're in there for about 3 weeks after they fully grow. And then they start hatching out into the adults, the stage we're perhaps most familiar with, in mid-June. And the females will live on into later in the fall, until August and September, when they start laying their eggs again. So they only have 1 generation per year. So a lot of insects that we're familiar with, monarch again is a great example, and they have 4 generations a year. So they can really build up populations pretty dramatically. Regal fritillaries with 1 generation, if something happens to that site, they're going to be considered a little bit more vulnerable on those sites. But it does make them easier to survey for. We have a pretty good idea of when they emerge, which is basically within the last week. But one important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about this is that the adult life stage of this butterfly is very short compared to the entire life cycle. You know, most of these, the females probably live almost an entire year from the egg into when they finally, as a female, lay eggs themselves. So they can be a long-lived forward invertebrate. So the one thing that Regal fritillaries need are violets. These are 4 species of violets that commonly occur on the prairie. In the top left, you see Viola sororia, the common blue violet. You may also be familiar with this one from your lawn. In the bottom left is bird's foot violet, Viola pedata. Bottom right is blue prairie violet, Viola pedata fida. And then in the top right is Viola sagittata. And so one of the things that we are exploring over the last couple of years is what this food source means. So in different parts of their range, Regal fritillaries historically have ranged from Oklahoma out to Pennsylvania, all the way north to Alberta and Manitoba. But they seem to use different species. Part of this is because these violet species don't occur across their entire range. But part of it may be just happenstance. So Viola sagittata, arrowleaf violet, is a good example. In Pennsylvania, this is the main food source of Regal fritillaries. But as you get over into Iowa, Minnesota, this species becomes far less common. Even in North Missouri, we don't get Viola sagittata, and most of our Regal fritillaries are probably reared on Viola pedata fida in the bottom right, the prairie violet. A lot of the Regals that we are in Illinois, a lot of Regals are reared on birds or Johnny jump ups, Viola bicolor, which I don't have a picture of here. But it's just important to know that, we'll say a lot of things here, but there's still a lot of unknowns. And then one of the big unknowns as regards this species is what feeding on different violets does for the butterfly, for the caterpillars. And so if you've seen me talk before, I like to include a slide or two of just pure speculation. And so here it is. So violets contain an isoflavonoid called vilanone, which has shown some antifungal and anti-insecticide or some insecticidal properties. One thing that's not in the literature at this moment is how our native violets vary in the concentrations of this vilanone. A lot of the study of this chemical has come out of China. This chemical is also contained in a lot of traditional Chinese medicine. And so that's where these 2 studies came out of. But one big question we have is are there fitness differences for Regal fritillaries feeding on different species of violet? Why would they prefer Viola, the prairie violet or the bird's foot violet over the common blue violet? If they could feed on common blue violet, we might have them in everybody's yard, and we wouldn't have to bother having this webinar today. So Regal fritillaries exhibit special sexual dimorphism. That is to say, the males and the females look different. You can see the male on the left here with a row of orange spots, and the female on the right with 2 red spots. And they also show differences in the timing of their emergence. So males tend to emerge first. They fly low over the prairie, presumably searching for females. On Friday, Dan and I saw a male mating with a really freshly emerged female, probably caught her just as she was coming out of her chrysalis. But they'll continue these patrols throughout the summer. And as the heat builds and, as they get later in life towards the beginning of July, those circles get longer and longer. But most males probably live no more than a month. Females the female adults, on the other hand, will live into August and September, at which point they lay their eggs on the prairie. One big question we still have, there's some debate on in the literature, is whether the females know how to find violets or not. I think many of us on this call are kind of convinced that these butterflies have some ability to find violets. If you have followed violets very often, they senesce in the summer. They're pretty much dried up now. And so they wouldn't be able to see them, but they may be able to use chemical receptors on their forelegs to find these things even when they're under the soil. So that may be something we'll talk about a little later. And so as a prairie species, one big question that exists is how these things coexist with prairie management, with the tool that maintains prairie. And the short and simple answer to this is poorly. Because they're very small, and because they're tucked into the thatch on the prairie all winter, anytime we burn that prairie, we have the possibility of killing those caterpillars. That's one big reason why we advocate and manage our prairies such that we don't burn more than a third of the prairie at any given time. It's to allow that reservoir of butterflies to repopulate the burned areas. And indeed, as we conduct surveys, these Regal fritillaries are far more prevalent in unburned areas, especially earlier in the year, than they are in the burned areas. So that's one big reason why we try to avoid burning an entire prairie. So these are probably the biggest, most conspicuous prairie obligate species that we have. And, they're also part of an ancestral relationship with their prairie. If we lose all of our prairies within the state, we will lose all of our regal fritillaries. We've already lost 99% of our prairies in the state. So that gives you a quick indication of where our populations are. But this map just goes to show you that these populations that were once widespread are now in a lot of trouble. This species was first petitioned for listing in 1989 when we gathered a lot of our initial information. And it was repetitioned in 2013 when a lot of the work you're going to hear about today began. Missouri is often thought to be one of the strongholds of the species. With more research, we're finding a lot more populations further north, especially North Dakota. Has quite a few regal fritillaries. South Dakota, Nebraska seem to be pretty secure. So some of our thinking is changing with more research, as is always the case. But here's kind of the current occurrences compared to the historic range. So you can see how much land this butterfly has been lost out of, including a lot of Missouri. So this is hard to read, but the darker dots are basically historic records, places where we haven't seen regal fritillaries in more than 20 years. Once the species was petitioned, we started a statewide survey. We still found regal fritillaries on 107 out of 133 sites. So we were able to say the species was still widely dispersed, but that didn't tell us how it was doing. So after we identified the populations, we started some long-term monitoring. These are some results from Pawnee Prairie up in Harrison County, where you can see they exhibit a life boom and bust population level, very similar, or what we think of for a lot of invertebrates. So 2018 was kind of our high water year. The estimate was 4,400 individuals. These were all done using distance transect sampling. So probably the trend is more important than the actual numbers here. But if you look at the difference between 2018 and 2020, you're talking orders of magnitude variation in just a couple of years. So our management can have a big influence on these butterflies, but it's also really important to maintain large tracts of prairie properly maintained to allow them the space and the ability to rebound on their own. And again, I just want to emphasize before I turn it over to Dan, that in conserving regal fritillaries and those large tracts of butterflies, our large tracts of prairie, we're also going to pull along a lot of other species that we know very little about. This is a Bisis skipper. It's not necessarily a prairie obligate, but it feeds on gamma grass, which is probably most common in prairies. And it's a species that has become a regional species of greatest conservation need. It's declining throughout the Midwest. And so the hope is that as we continue to study and preserve habitat for regal fritillaries, we're also going to end up preserving a lot of things that we're not paying the same level of attention to. All right, so Dan.
Thank you, Steve. That was a great introduction. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Marschalek, whose research spans the fields of entomology, ecology, and conservation. Projects typically combine quantitative, entomological, and ecological research with the goal of informing data-driven decisions for the management and conservation of native species and communities. Current research projects include studying endangered butterflies at the population and community level and ecosystem functioning at the broader community level. This represents his philosophy on conservation. 1, endangered species are in need of immediate attention to prevent extinction, and 2, ecosystem processes and diverse groups of species must be maintained to prevent the further decline of important species and loss of the services they provide. I'll turn it over to you, Dan.
All right, thank you for the introduction. I'm Dan Marschalek. I'm with the University of Central Missouri, and I've been collaborating with another faculty member, Dr. Walcott, who's also at UCM. As you can see in the picture, we've utilized a lot of students in the field to collect data, and I should mention appreciation to both Missouri Prairie Foundation and MDC for access to the preserves, as well as funding to support this work. All right, so Steve just showed this map a little while ago, but it shows how widespread the regal fritillary used to be. So it used to be found in the upper Midwest all the way to the Atlantic coast, and now is really restricted mostly to the upper Midwest. The main reason for the decline is attributed to habitat loss. And if you think about what's going on with the Missouri prairies, this is a historical map looking at or showing the prairies in the yellow color. So roughly about a third, and the northern third of the state was prairie. But as I'm sure most of you know, we have about less than 0.5% of tall grass prairie remaining. So anytime you have these large habitat declines, you should expect that the species that depend on these habitats are going to decrease both in their distribution, but also population sizes. With our grasslands, again, most of you I'm sure know, they need some kind of disturbance or management. Otherwise, the shrubby vegetation will, or I said woody vegetation will encroach, and then you'll have a form of habitat loss. So there's a number of different ways to manage and introduce some disturbance to maintain our grasslands. And for those species that are dependent on the grasslands, managers really need to have a good idea of how to manipulate that system so that it benefits the species. And so that's what's really driving a lot of the work I've been doing recently. So we've really been looking at two main goals or objectives right now, thinking about how many regals there are. So quantifying the densities of Regal Fritillary butterflies in a number of prairies near Sedalia. Those specifically are the coal camp prairies. And then I guess to give away a little bit of the results, we find that some areas have very dense populations and some do not. And so we're trying to investigate what particular habitat characteristics they might be preferring in context of management as well, with the idea that if we can identify what they need or prefer, then we can elevate that in our landscapes and hopefully increase population sizes. So this is just a map showing the different study sites near just south of Sedalia. Most of the work I'm going to talk about is in these northern 5 prairies. So Friendly, Lordy Marker, Drovers, Paintbrush, and Markers Prairie. For our butterfly surveys, I would like to say we conducted exhaustive searches. We did this by systematically walking parallel transects, usually in this case, 4 individuals walking together, spaced out far enough to be efficient, but we're close enough so that a Regal Fritillary could not fly between us and go undetected. We would record the location of each Regal Fritillary butterfly with the GPS unit. And one year we chased after them and netted them, and any captured Regal Fritillaries we would mark with colored Sharpies. And you can see in the upper right, I believe that's a green, red, and dark blue color added to the Regal Fritillary there. So they were uniquely marked. With all those GPS points and locations, we could investigate where they're found. And this is a heat map, kind of a visual display of areas where they are more dense or using more frequently, shown in dark blue. And then areas where they're very low densities or not using at all, those are unshaded. And we wanted to be fairly systematic with investigating those habitat characteristics that might be important. So we, I guess we'll say strategically selected locations that had high densities and sampled there, but also picked some areas of low densities. Also wanted to look at areas that were recently burned. So that means within the year previous to the flight season, and some areas that were not burned. So this is kind of what our vegetation sampling looked like with the yellow crosses there, some in the low density and some in the high density, some in a recently burned area and some outside of it. Our vegetation sampling was kind of at a core scale, looking more at the vegetation structure rather than composition itself. So we recorded the percent cover of things like bare ground, litter, grasses, and shrubs. We also measured the vegetation height and counted the number of flowers for each flowering plant species. So this is the results of our marking study. So I'll start with the table on the left here. You see that we marked 542 individual, and I should say uniquely marked 542 individuals. So it was a pretty good success. You'll notice that a lot more males were marked than females. Females are typically more secretive, so that was somewhat expected. Also, you'll see that the numbers, which represent a minimum known population size at each of these preserves, does vary. So some had larger populations than others. One thing that I think is probably the most important thing to come out of our marking study was that we were able to recapture some individuals. And as you can see on the map on the right side, we had a number of individuals that were able to move from one prairie to another. So that the arrows represent the directions they moved and the number of individuals moving in that direction. So we had 12 individuals that started at marker prairie and went to paintbrush, for example. So this is showing some preliminary results from and efforts from 2019, as well as more intensive efforts in 2020. So they are able to move several kilometers or miles. Also includes them passing somehow over the Highway 65 here, which has 2 lanes in each direction. So the movement, I'll talk about a little bit later, really important for the long-term persistence of this species or any species. The preserves did vary in size, so we did calculate densities to standardize for that. And again, we saw variation among the preserves. And then I've already kind of given away a little bit of this. We've seen that there's variation within the preserve. So certain areas that they're certainly preferring to use over others. And this is where management and fire kind of came into a lot of our minds. If you can see the yellow dashed line in the lower right on the paintbrush prairie, that was a fire break. They burned the western side, but not the eastern side. And as you crossed over into the unburned area, we really encountered a lot of butterflies. So it was really drastic. Same idea with friendly prairie. They burned this particular year on the west side, but not the east side. And again, we see lots of regals in the unburned area. However, I do want to point out that regals are still in and using the burned areas, and this kind of northern part of paintbrush we believe was burned and still had a good number of regals using it. So it's not an all or nothing type of thing. But the kind of big question was, why are they, or what is it about these areas that they're using? Is it something about the vegetation that they're preferring? So that's what we investigated. This is a biplot graph that shows all of our vegetation sampling areas or plots, and those are represented by the colored symbols, and they are color coded for not only the sites, but if that particular area burned within the last year or not. So it's a way to visualize a lot of data all at once. I'm just going to pick out a couple things to highlight. But the way to interpret this is that if there's 2 symbols or plots that are close together, like these 2 purple diamonds, for example. Hopefully you can see my cursor. Those are close on this graph. That means they are very similar in terms of their vegetation structure. If they're far apart, like the green in the upper right and the cross in the lower left, that means those sites are quite a bit different from one another. So that's kind of the simple way to interpret it. I've also overlaid our different categories that we collected data on. So if there's a point further to the right than another one, it's grassier. And if you are kind of in the upper left, more bare ground, or down below, more leaf litter. So a couple things I just want to highlight. You can see that the colors are kind of condensed or grouping together. So we're able to see differences among the different prairies. And we're also able to see differences in the burned and unburned. So the vegetation structure is different, and that might not be too surprising. So this is just looking at friendly prairie, the unburned area. Those sites are down here. They have a little bit more grass and leaf litter compared to those that were just recently burned that has kind of in the direction of the bare ground. So those are fairly predictable and are sampling was picking up on that, which is reassuring. And same thing with paintbrush. So again, the unburned areas typically have more grass compared to more bare ground for the burned areas. One thing I do want to point out here is that both, I'll flip back, friendly here and paintbrush there, they have quite a bit of variation in the vegetation structure in the prairies, and oftentimes with that heterogeneity of the habitat, that leads to more robust and stable population. So that might be helping out the Regal Fritillaries. Kind of mentioned burning and burned and unburned areas. We also looked at the number and types of flowers. And again, we kind of see two different vegetation types based on the flowering plants. There's some plants that are flowering right after a burn and some that are flowering, a year or two after. So we are starting to see some vegetative differences within the burned and unburned areas. So ultimately, we wanted kind of a target to provide management and say this is what they're really preferring. The burn status as well as the amount of bare ground were approaching significance with some initial tests. We're still working through these data, but it wasn't strong enough to say for certain that those were really important, at least based on our current sampling design. But since I mentioned the impact of fire, and many of us have seen it kind of as we're walking through different management units, I thought Friendly Prairie offers a interesting perspective because at least over the last 3 years, they've been burning half and then switching to the other side each year. So in 2020, they burned the west side, and most of the Regal Fritillaries were on the east side. And then densities flip-flopped as they kind of burned the other half. And then in 2022, this is surveys from just last Friday. So maybe a little early and the numbers are a little bit lower, but you can see that same pattern. So it seems that they are preferring the areas that were at least a year past burning. So just to kind of summarize, we are seeing that the densities of Regal Fritillaries are variable. There's some sites or preserves that seem to have bigger populations than others, and they're certainly selecting certain areas of the preserves, but we're not quite sure what exactly they're picking up on there. It does seem that the use of fire is at least temporarily reducing numbers, but it does seem that they can coexist with the use of fire. So I think that's at least a initial and important conclusion. I mentioned before the movement from preserve or prairie to prairie is really important. That allows not only individuals to move into areas after a fire to recolonize, but it also helps with gene flow and preventing negative impacts from inbreeding. And when you're talking about rare endangered species, inbreeding, the importance of that and the detrimental impacts of that is starting to be more clearly known and can be extremely important and happen very quickly with little warning. So it's important to have that connectivity. We're still looking for that vegetation target to provide management. One thing I think that we did was we surveyed all suitable habitat. All of our prairies had Regal Fritillaries. The variation might not have been big enough to pick out. So we have plans to have a wider scale project looking at a variety of different grassland types with varying qualities. And hopefully that will help provide a little bit more information with in terms of what we should be managing for the Regal Fritillaries. So one thing I do want to point out, and kind of leading into Chris's section here, all of this work was done with adult butterflies. It's important to consider the larval resources as well, because they are generally less mobile. So that's potentially something that's going to be added into this line of research. So I'll go ahead and stop and turn it over to Chris.
I'm here.
Yes, thank you so much. Next is Dr. Chris Barnhart. He is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Missouri State University. He studies the conservation-related biology of mollusks and butterflies and collaborates with agencies concerned with endangered species restoration and aquatic toxicology. Chris and his wife, Deborah, curate the Dr. Bill Roston Native Butterfly House at the Springfield Greene County Botanical Center.
Thank you, Carol. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you. So I think
Well, at
everyone
least
probably
Carol can hear me. Well, you've already answered the question that I wanted to ask, and that's what's a clam guy? I've studied clams most of my life. What's a clam guy doing with butterflies? And it's a childhood fascination with me that I've come back to kind of post-retirement. But 14 years ago, my friend Bill Roston started a butterfly house in Springfield, and he intended this as an educational exercise. And I was drawn into it. And after he had a stroke and later died just a few years ago, my wife and I have kind of taken it over. And one of the things that we do is we raise the butterflies for the butterfly house. We try not to rely on wild stock. So we've gotten into captive culture in a pretty big way. And it's the idea of culturing endangered species for research and restoration is something that I pursued with the freshwater mussels too. And one of the butterflies that I call it my bread and butter fly in the butterfly house, is another fritillary. It's the great spangled fritillary, a close relative of the regal. And we've cultured this butterfly by the hundreds for a number of years now. So I thought I might know something. I found out I didn't know as much as I thought I did, but when Steve and I got to talking about this a few years ago, it seemed like a natural thing that we should try to generate some larvae and do some experiments with them. So there's not just regal fritillaries. In North America, there's actually 16 species in the genus Speria, which is the greater fritillaries, and 3 of them are in our area. The regal and the Diana fritillary, which is probably even more threatened, are both species of concern. But the great spangled fritillary is quite common and very widespread, and it's actually quite diverse. There's a lot of different subspecies of the great spangled. So it's interesting to consider how they're similar and how they're different. And we tried to pair up observations between these 2 species this past year. Steve did a nice job of summarizing the regal fritillary life cycle. It's unusual, but it's typical for the genus. All of them, all 16 species do the same thing. Single brood, eggs laid in the fall. The larvae hatch, but then they hibernate all winter and they feed on violets in the spring. The adults fly. In June, the males go first and then the females. And it's interesting that this particular lifestyle has been able to be adapted to a number of different habitats, from montane to lowland situations, dry prairies, mesic forests. The larvae need violets in sufficient density. That point was made. Point that I'd like to also add is that the adults require high quality nectar continuously from May through October. Most butterflies don't live this long. Most butterflies only live for a matter of a few weeks at most, and these butterflies live for months. Another thing that I want to emphasize is the larval stage is not one thing. The eggs are a different life stage. When they hatch, these are among the smallest butterfly larvae. They're really, really tiny. And this means that they can't move very far. They have to be close to the host plant or they're going to die. They grow a lot, and once they reach full size, they're voracious. And in the spring, violet plants can be quite small, and a mature larva is going to need to consume multiple plants. So there's 2 spatial challenges there. One is for the larva, when it hatches, to be within centimeters of the food, or else it's going to starve. And then that the large larva be in an area that has sufficient density that it can find what it needs. I mentioned the nectar resources. We've worked at Comstock, Prairie, and this is the sequence of floral resources that we've seen at Comstock over the course of the summer. each of these flowers at different times and in different places. Those butterflies, as Dan was saying, are quite mobile. They move around to take advantage of the resources. They may even potentially move off of the prairie and come back. A lot of questions there. So for this study, there's a lot of things that we've done over the last 2 years, and I don't have time to talk about all of them. I'd sure like to. So I'll buzz past some slides, and if you have a question, you can ask later. But basically, we started out with the question of what are the conditions that lead to overwintering success of these microscopically small larvae on the prairie. They're out there in the blazing sun, they're out there under the snow, they're potentially out there when a fire passes over. What densities of host plants are required for reproduction? How do regals differ from the common widespread congener, the great spangled, which occurs on the prairie too, right alongside of it? And then finally, this was sort of the, off across the horizon, but by the time we got into this, we realized we had thousands of larvae. Can we use captive culture to introduce and reintroduce regals to suitable sites to achieve that connectivity that Dan was talking about? So we started out working at Comstock, Prairie, and we did some field studies where we recorded temperature and humidity and surveyed violet density. This is Comstock. It's a really nice area, a little bit further away than we would have liked, but we recorded winter temperature and humidity in the winter of 2020 to 21. And we had loggers at 2 different elevations. The larvae, we presume, are right at the surface. They don't really have any capacity to burrow. We don't know where they are actually, but we got records and we found that temperature at the ground surface was about 2 degrees Celsius. It varied quite a bit. You can see these fluctuations. And the humidity was quite high, averaged about 92%. So that's good places for us to start. We also were curious about violets. I'm new to this, the plant ecology of it, so I was anxious to do some work to get an introduction. So Derek Bateman, a student here, and I surveyed transects at Comstock, and we recorded the plants in 2-meter plots along each transect. And we got pretty good coverage on Comstock. The squares here are the plots, and there are transects within each plot. And it's a heat diagram where red is the highest densities, an average of 4.6 violet plants per meter square. That's not leaves, it's plants, individual plants. And we found that 32% of plots at Comstock had more than 1 plant per meter square. Not very much when you think about it. 19% of plots had more than 2 plants per meter square. And in June, these plants, might have 5 leaves on them. This is mainly Viola sagittata, the arrow leaf violet. A challenge. I'm going to jump ahead to captive culture. And we started the first time with just a few females and didn't do very well. I won't tell you about that effort. In 2021, we got 10 females, thanks to MDC helping us out. And these came from 5 different prairies. And we held them over their egg laying period, and they laid over 20,000 eggs for us. And this is one of those things like when you're buying seeds in the garden store, and you think, oh, they're so small. Well, yeah, butterfly eggs start small, but the workload gets big if you try to raise any kind of numbers. Here's the approach. We didn't originate this. We modified it a bit, but this is a butterfly henhouse. We've got incandescent lamps here. It's hard to buy an incandescent light bulb these days. Everybody's gone LED. Well, we wanted heat as well as light. So we ended up searching high and low for incandescent bulbs. We use those to control temperature and photoperiod. The butterflies are in paper bags. And within that paper bag, there's a little tuft of violet leaves in a corsage tube, and water in a little tray so that they can water. And we controlled temperature at 22 to 32 C. So we'd start low in the morning, go high at midday, and then come down again by keeping these lights on timers. And this is what it looks like inside of one of those bags. So little tufted violets in a corsage tube, a bit of paper strip and paper towels. We didn't know what substrate they'd really prefer. It turned out that they'll lay eggs on the violet leaves. They'll lay eggs on the paper strips. They'll lay them on the paper towel. But what they didn't do was lay them on the sides of the bag or on the floor. They wanted some structure, and that's kind of interesting. I'm going to take a chance here and go to something else. Can you see a video now, or are we still looking at my slides? Carol, can you tell me?
I'm still looking at your slides.
Okay, I got to share a different screen. All right. I'm going to stop share. I'm going to share this. How are we doing now?
Yes, I think I see video now.
Okay, this is how you feed a fritillary. They become quite tame in captivity. We needed to provide them with nectar. There's a commercially available mix. It's quite good. So each day, each individual female was allowed about 30 seconds to a minute to drink its fill. And that's how we took care of that. Let's see now. Egg laying. Actually, I think I like this one a little bit better. So this is a female fritillary probing with their abdomen. I've seen great spangled fritillary do this in soil. They seem to be able to sense the substrate with their abdomen. They'll also probe with their proboscis sometimes as though they're tasting. And this might be a way of sensing the potential presence of violets. Even if the violet weren't there, a chemical signal could be present. Okay, back to the slides. So here's the results of a month of work here. Egg laying commenced in early September, peaked 2 weeks later, and then declined mid-October. This is about the pattern that we expected based on field observations. This is the number of eggs laid per day, daily egg production by 10 females. So it started right at the end of August, it ramped up, and then it slowly declined. This is the feeding, the average consumption in microliters. So this is just about a drop of fluid per female. And they would feed pretty consistently. We determined this by weighing until it got to be, the third week in September or so. And then the feeding started to decline and the egg production started to decline. And eventually they ended up as specimens in alcohol, destined for a genetic lab. And these are the eggs. As I say, they're quite willing to lay on the violet, but they're not all that discriminating about where they lay. It's just they want it to be in a tangle of something. And certainly egg laying in captivity is facilitated by the presence of violets. Didn't get this kind of production without violets being present. So I think that's interesting, but because they're captive, you can't read too much into it. The fertility of the eggs was quite high. These butterflies had mated at least once. They might have mated multiple times. Fertility was over 95%. The eggs incubated 20 to 27 days if we kept them at 20 degrees Celsius. Now that's probably longer than it would be in the field, but it depends on the temperature. Depends on the temperature during the period of incubation, which is late fall, and it's probably going to be quite a lot warmer than this on average. If we lowered the humidity below 54%, the hatching would be delayed. And then you could trigger it again by restoring high humidity. And we tested the tolerance of the eggs to different levels of humidity and compared it with Great Spangled. And we found that the Regal is quite a lot more tolerant of low humidity. The Regal eggs are more tolerant of low humidity. The hatch of the Great Spangled Fritillary eggs was reduced by half if you took humidity down to 33%, which is that's about as dry as you would ever want it in your house. Air conditioning might lower it to 33%. And none of them hatched at lower humidity. But the Regals 90% of them would hatch at 33% relative humidity, and even 20% on desiccant. That's remarkable. Now, they didn't hatch until you raise the humidity back up again. But even the ones that have been kept on desiccant, if you raise the humidity, then 20% of them were able to hatch after that dehydration. So Regals are quite tolerant of low humidity, maybe remarkably so compared to this close relative. There are a lot of factors that potentially affect their overwinter survival. Dehydration is one. The eggs are resistant to dehydration, but the larvae not so much. The larvae require high humidity if they're not feeding, because they're not able to absorb water vapor from the air unless perhaps it gets very near saturation. They do drink when they get the chance, and you can see these little guys expanding as they drink from this drop of water. But if you're trying to hold these larvae over the winter, which is what you have to do, you don't want to hold them in a situation where fungus is going to develop. And again, in captive culture, this is a big issue. Whether it's the same in nature, not entirely clear. But these larvae died because they were overtaken by fungus. These eggs were on violet leaf, and they were placed at a high humidity. On the violet leaf, fungus developed, and you see the result of that. They do better if you keep them on paper, a surface that doesn't permit fungal growth, at least not as readily. And then there's dormancy. You know, these animals, they go dormant. They have to starve over the winter. They want to reduce their metabolic rate as low as they can. This is a dormant individual right here. This is an individual the same age that's fed. And you can see it's expanded, it's much more active. I'm sure its metabolic rate is up. And, you know, what do they do in the fall? Do they stay dormant? Under what conditions might they arouse? And would that be a good thing or a bad thing? If they had access to food, would they feed? Well, we did some experiments on that, but I probably need to buzz along here. This is how we overwintered the larvae, the hatched larvae. We placed them in 2-ounce condiment cups. And these are the same sorts of things that you get salad dressing in, right? So about 50 larvae in a condiment cup, often on the same strip of paper that their eggs were laid on. And alongside of them are cups that contain a saturated solution of potassium nitrate. And this will equilibrate in a closed atmosphere in a sealed box to regulate about 96% relative humidity, which turns out to be a sweet spot for overwintering the larvae. We stored them at 2 degrees Celsius in an incubator. We maintained a photoperiod that reflected the shortening day length into the winter and the lengthening day length into the spring, thinking that that signal might be useful. But we kept the temperature constant. We didn't do that the first time. The first time we allowed the temperature to fluctuate similar to ambient, but we got very low survival in that situation. So then the second time in 2021-22, we kept that temperature constant at 2 degrees with the seasonal photoperiod. And we got, you know, about half of the boxes would have over 90% survival over the winter, and about half of them wouldn't. We still don't know exactly which variables were involved here, but, you know, plenty of room for speculation. This is what the larvae look like during the winter. They sit tight. Often they seem to be sitting right where they hatched, and they don't mind each other's company. If anything, there might be some tendency for them to aggregate, which is curious since the females are thought to lay individual eggs scattered around the prairie. We did some experiments allowing them to feed and drink before lowering the temperature to set them dormant. We also did experiments where we allowed the temperature to drop gradually instead of just dropping them down to 2. And Regals were perfectly willing to become active and feed if food was available, even down to fairly low temperatures around 15 degrees. And they even molted before the seasonal temperature that we were mimicking got low enough to make them go to sleep. But that was fatal. If they fed and drank before going dormant, survivorship was near 0. Interestingly, the great spangled fritillary were much more reluctant to do this. And they survived at higher rates in such conditions as a result. When the larvae are getting ready for this winter sleep, they'll make a silken pad. I don't know if you can see it, but there's little fibers of silk here. They sit on that. They do a similar thing before they molt. And it's possible that this is, in fact, a way of maintaining their position if it was raining on them or if there was some other disturbance. And if they do arouse in the fall, they have to repeat this preparation or forego it. And that potentially one of the reasons why fall activity is not good for them. Well, here's how they look when they start feeding. And right after they wake up, they're perfectly willing to start feeding on violet. The violet in this case is viola bicolor, or Johnny Jump Up, that Steve mentioned. And we found that to be a very convenient food this year, not only for the Regals, but also for Great Spangled. And it's really the first year that we've used it. This is a common weedy native. It's very common in Springfield. The lawn outside my office here, Temple Hall, is just rife with it. And it has a lot of small leaves in contrast to most violets. And this is great because there's a lot of edge. And if you're trying to raise thousands of small larvae, you'd like to have a lot of edge and a lot of separate perches for them. So one of those cups that they overwintered in, we just add water, add some Johnny Jump Up, and away they go. And then we would pool them into larger containers as they grew. And I had some adventures with overstocking these boxes. You don't want to go too far. They can get stuck in a paste of their own excrement if you're not careful. We also experimented with pansies as food, and other people have tried this as well. And pansies seem to be working just fine. The greenhouse, not so much. We were keeping these in the university greenhouse, and the temperatures became extreme. And our next door neighbor was vaporizing sulfur to control spider mites, and things eventually didn't go well in the greenhouse. And we took most of the survivors home, but they did feed well on pansies. And nice thing about pansies is you can color coordinate for photography. So this is Rhonda holding a couple of the older larvae in the MSU greenhouse. Here's a tray of pansies before and after fritillary feeding. And these are mature larvae. It's a beautiful larva. Yeah, I don't think the chrysalis looks too bad either, Steve. It can be, I'd say it's one of the more decorative chrysali that I'm familiar with. Pupation is kind of an issue for fritillaries. We don't really know where they pupate on the prairie, and it's interesting to me to hear these stories of people seeing freshly closed females. I'd like to know where they pupated. We tried setting up some, semi-natural situations, a plug of sod with grass stems, a clump of violet, and placed in these situations, they would just climb up to the top of the cage and pupate on the ceiling. It's the most unnatural thing available. We do like to use crumpled coffee filters, paper coffee filters, and these are inverted, and they like those closed spaces. And something that we observed this time that I don't think has been mentioned by anyone previously is that Regal fritillaries make something of a cocoon. It's not much of a cocoon, it's just a little webbing of silk that they kind of tie edges together with to give themselves a shelter. And of course, they spin a button of silk that the cremaster is stuck into. That said, getting them onto a secure perch or having them find a secure perch is an issue. They don't pupate well in the conditions that we give them, and we lose maybe 20 or 25% because they fall. They fall during the process of molting to the chrysalis. Well, this is how we raise fritillaries at home, and we ended up raising most of our successful Regal fritillaries in the same way and feeding them on Viola sororia, the common weedy violet. And we got maybe 60 adults successfully through to pupation. We'd hoped to have more like 300, but circumstances conspired against us. Most of the releases that we did were larvae, and this was our intent all along. It's a lot of work to raise these butterflies to adulthood, but it's pretty easy to generate thousands of caterpillars. So these are the numbers that we released and the prairies where they were put. These are the caterpillar releases, and we chose Linden's Prairie and released 44 adults there, a total of about 3,500 regals out there on the prairie. We packaged the second instar larvae, and these are still quite small, just millimeters in length. Packaged them with a sprig of Johnny Jump Up, so they had something to start with, and a little bit of paper as a marker. And then we would, there's a lot of work involved in packaging these. I think we packaged up about 1,500 of these cups. And when I say we, I mean the students. Oh, I did my share. And then we carted those out to the prairie and had a lot of enthusiastic response. This is a fun thing to do, turning fritillaries loose on the prairie. And basically you just find a violet. This is the important thing. You find a host plant for them and then place them directly on it and leave the paper behind as a marker so the volunteer coming up behind you doesn't step on it or double up the larvae. And we use cell phone photos to maintain a record of location. Still working with those data. I think it has a lot of possibilities though. It's quick and easy and everybody has a cell phone. Now here we are at Shuett on the 1st of May, and this is late. We're releasing second instar larvae on May 1st. We're probably 3 to 4 weeks late doing this. And this is why I've been telling Steve, you don't need to be going out looking for them now. It's too soon. You want to wait until, second week in July, and then that's when they're going to be flying. Nonetheless, somebody made a liar out of me and saw 2 regals at Shuett this week, but I suspect that those had flown from Petite Gem. We released older larvae at Petite Gem, and we released them earlier. Not much earlier, but they were much older larvae, 3rd and 4th instar. And they are definitely flying there. Shooty is amazing. These are all bird's foot violet. Jared's done an amazing job out here. I understand that this was just a bunch of cedar trees a few years ago, and it's incredibly beautiful. Of course, all the coneflower is up now, and the blazing star is coming. But we released over 600 larvae out here, and I suspect there's going to be a boatload of fritillaries flying there in a couple of weeks. We went out to the Petite Gem on June 11th because Deb and I were really anxious to see if anything had happened. And we had actually released 30 of them even a little bit earlier than the big batch. And we saw 2 in 30 minutes. So we felt pretty good about that. Now, Steve reports that he found 11. Was that today, Steve, or yesterday? Steve's
Monday.
So 11 out there, and I'll credit the 2 at Shooty to Petite Gem. I think they just flew over there. And then again, Linden's, we put some adults out there, and this was an opportunity for an op-adult to come out and take pictures. We marked these on advice from Dan with a fluorescent Sharpie. And this was, it's fun to release adults. We had chases going on. There's a couple of our captive cultured males chasing each other. And it's also a real an opportunity for photography. Unfortunately, I understand Jared didn't find them today. He was out at Linden's and didn't see any, but they were there. We've got photographic proof. Well, I hope I didn't go on too long. I got a lot more, but I'll wait for questions. And thanks to everybody that's helped with this. And this isn't everybody. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope we get to participate more.
Thank you very much, Chris, Dan, and Steve. You have done an incredible amount of work for this amazing insect. We do have a number of questions. Someone asked about, do we have information about date of burns versus results, or I guess by results, the person who posted this question is wondering about data. And I can tell you that the Missouri Prairie Foundation, the prairies that we burn, we do have burn plans and dates recorded of when we burned them, but I'm not sure if you correlated those data with your work. I don't know which, maybe Dan, if you wanted to answer that.
Yeah, we haven't looked specifically at dates of fires or if it's like a fall versus spring or anything like that. Right now, we're on we have a small sample size of like 5 prairies. So if you start splitting it up, well, it's just challenging, I guess. You'd have one spring and one fall or 2 of each.
I can say that the Missouri Prairie Foundation prescribed burns take place always in the dormant season from anywhere between November and February. So we're doing those whenever the weather opportunities allow for those to take place. And we generally burn no more than 1/3 or 1/2 of a tract at a time for the reasons that you all have stated today, and for the habitat needs of other wildlife as well. We had another, oh, Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I would add that I have experience of one with fire, and that's at Comstock. After we started working out there, after we'd instrumented the prairie, there was an arson fire that burned the half. The north half had been burned intentionally last spring, and the south half burned by arson on the 20th of March, which is later than managers would like to burn. Fritillaries came through that just fine. So that's one observation. But I'm a fan of fire. Again, I'm probably the most ignorant person here about prairie management, but I can see the effects of it. And I think burning in March probably isn't inimical to regals.
Yeah, we like to avoid March. And of course, as has been noted, the fire is critically important to perpetuate the prairie and for stimulating forms for blooming, and that's a nectar source that the butterflies need. I was wondering, Steve, and all of you could answer this, but maybe Steve, you could address it first. The fire, I would think, does it help the regals find the violets? I mean, or could they find them through duff layer if an area wasn't burned?
I think both can be true. One observation we made during the releases this spring is that certainly in burned areas, the violets were far more advanced. They were a lot easier for us to find to release a regal caterpillar onto, but they were often 2 or 3 times as big. So, if a regal caterpillar were to make it through the fire, the food resources would probably be a lot better for that caterpillar. But in the duffy areas, their chances at survival are higher. So it's probably a mixed bag.
Thank you. And as another question, have the effects of grazing management been studied regarding the Regal Fritillary, such as grazing that's occurring at Pawnee Prairie in northern Missouri? And that's a prairie owned by the Missouri Department of Conservation and also a park by the Nature Conservancy. Steve, you might be more familiar perhaps with that, and then maybe Dan, you might want to address it as well.
Yeah, so we're not, well, I can say as of last summer, we weren't currently grazing Pawnee. It's been a few years now. But, grazing, the research that's been done on grazing in Missouri is kind of, again, it's mixed. So grazing can help to create that structural heterogeneity. But where I see the biggest impacts on grazing are on floral resources. I think a lot of times you hear these very showy prairies referred to as calendar prairies, that they're good for taking pictures of, but not necessarily for the inhabitants. But they're also pollinator prairies. Those nectar resources are exactly what these adults need in order to survive, in order to be able to produce those eggs. And a lot of the grazing decreasers on the prairie, the plants that decrease under cattle grazing, such as pale purple coneflower, also happen to be very good nectar sources for the Regal Fritillaries. So I think like any tool, it's probably, if it's overused, it can be bad, but it may have a role. Now, we have seen some indication that cattle also graze pretty heavily on violets, but that's something that we're hoping to work with Dan a little bit more. We just got a big science project funded through the Department of Conservation to start looking more at the effects of management on Regal fritillaries and answer some of these questions.
Thank you. There's another question about challenges or evidence of inbreeding among Regals. Perhaps Dan, you could address that, and if others of you want to chime in, please do.
Yeah, there's been, so this is not specific to Regals, but applying other situations to the Regals, but there's been a number of studies that have documented inbreeding in smaller butterfly populations. And also I'm aware of some speculation as well from other examples where the populations start getting smaller, and then all of a sudden, like in a year or two, they're just gone. And there's been some studies that have documented with the actual genetic diversity through the time. I think the one, at least personally, the one big consideration or concern I have is that threshold's, I don't think, ever known until you reach it, and then it's too late. So, we just don't know what it would be for something like the Regal Fritillary unless, we studied it and then they disappeared. Then I guess we would know, but it'd be too late. So there's kind of two things about that movement that's really important. One is it allows them to access a lot more resources. So it allows them to be a bigger population. And then also that helps with the gene flow and movement and maintaining genetic diversity.
Thank you. And as kind of a follow-up, Chris, the individual females from which you collected the eggs, so how many eggs would that be? I mean, that was a lot of genetic material from just a few individuals, correct? I mean, a lot of eggs from just a few individuals. Am I correct on that?
It's from 10 individuals and about 2,000, actually 2,200 average eggs per female. So yeah, 10 individuals, and those females had made it at least once. So figure 20 individuals represented. If they made it twice, there might be 30 individuals represented. When you get up to 30 individuals, you're capturing over 90%, guesstimates are, you're capturing over 90% of the genetic diversity within a population. So I think this was a good sample. And if we were trying to reintroduce Regals to an area, I think it's a reasonable number to get eggs from 10 females. Now, you don't have to get 2,200 eggs from each female. We could release the females after getting maybe half that many eggs. We had far more eggs than we could really work with. I wanted to say too, I think these small prairies, I just wanted to make a point that I'm becoming convinced of. I think these small prairies are important for Regal fritillaries, and I don't doubt for other species too. I want to show you a figure I've got here, if I can find it. Let's see, is that what I wanted? No, that's not what I wanted. How about that? Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Okay, this is data that I got from Chris Snubel and also from a paper by Kelly and Dubinsky in 1998. This is Regal fritillary populations versus site area. And the small prairies that we're talking about, like Petit Gem and Shooty, are down here in this range, maybe 15 hectares. And I guess the point I wanted to make is that more than half of these 47 sites where Regals occur and have occurred consistently, that's why they're being surveyed, because Regals are known to be there. More than half of these are less than 100 hectares, and the population estimate from the surveys averages less than 300 butterflies. So That's a lot of the species that's down there on those small prairie remnants. I don't think they're irrelevant. And I don't think it would be irrelevant to try to reestablish regals on small prairies like this, particularly if they're close together, like Pettit, Gem, and Shooty can probably, Dan's data show, they can move back and forth between there potentially.
Well, with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, we definitely think there's extremely high conservation value to a remnant of any size for this reason and for other reasons. And as Steve was mentioning, it's also a matter of the quality of the food resources. We have a few other questions here. Pete asks, how far do adults typically fly? From Dan's plot, a lot of them seemed quite local. They seemed like strong flyers and would guess that they have the potential to fly far if needed. Do males fly farther than females, or is there any difference between the sexes? Unrelated, it would make sense that they may not want to pupate on violets if there are any predators that target violets specifically to eat them, or if they detect evidence of their presence on violets, such as waste material.
Yeah, I guess I can comment on the movement and dispersal. I don't off the top of my head know the kind of average or well-known dispersal ability, but they have the ability to fly a pretty good distance. I think it's like probably every 99.9% of species, they typically stay at home because it's safe, but a couple of them risk it and go far away and have the ability to do that. So I think that's, what we found was pretty consistent, but I think one thing that's often not considered with dispersal is the landscape that they're going over. So if you have, I don't know, like I guess Flint Hills is probably a pretty big continuous prairie. There's no reason they wouldn't just keep going, I guess. But if you have more of a fragmented landscape, they typically do kind of come up to the edge of a prairie and turn back and stay in there.
Thank you. And can you or Steve or Chris comment on, are there predators that target violet species, I guess, knowing that the regals might be there? Or do they detect evidence of their presence on violets, such as waste material? Is anything known about that?
Yeah, there is plenty of evidence that parasitoids, wasps, and dipterans that lay their eggs on caterpillars or chrysalis and then feed within them. There's plenty of evidence that they can detect signals both from the plant and from the waste products from the caterpillars. So that is a possibility. I don't know of any specific studies with fritillaries on that, but that is the case. Yeah, and we've got a bit of an issue with parasitoids with the butterfly house because we have very high densities of caterpillars and chrysalis, and we get a diversity of parasitoids that show up in there every year because they can smell it, smell the resource, and they come right in through the net. So
thank
you. Good
you.
opportunity to study them, actually.
Just a couple more questions. I know it's after 5, so we need to wrap up, but there's still some really good questions if you have time for just a couple more. Do you know, there's an observation here. Literature seems to suggest that regals prefer milkweed and thistle for nectar sources. Does this seem to be the case on Missouri's prairies? Steve, maybe you could address that?
Well, I mean, I think Chris showed it really well with his illustration. Milkweeds and thistles supposed to have a very finite blooming period. So what they're nectaring on is going to vary based on the time of the year. Certainly now when the males are out and the populations are at the highest level, milkweed, especially butterfly milkweed, is a very, very attractive plant form. But it's going to be out of bloom in a few weeks, and so they move on. So it really is time dependent.
It seems that in so many photographs I see of regals there on pale purple coneflowers, maybe because the flowers are tall enough that it makes for easier photography. I'm not sure. A few other questions here about violets and regals. And of course, you stated that in Missouri, regals are almost exclusively associated with prairie and with those violet species that occur on prairie. And of course, the Steve, you showed the more common violet that occurs on prairies, but those other 3 species that are pretty closely tied to prairie, but maybe also glade. So I think the answer to why do regals need prairie is the food source, but also would you like other indications? Is it the open nature of prairies? Steve, do you want to address that?
I mean, I think that's a great question that, I don't know. I don't have the answer to. There is indication that it's the open nature of the landscape, but if you go down to the White River Hills, those glades there are extensive enough that, from a butterfly's perspective, they don't seem substantially different from a prairie. Yet we only have maybe 2 records from that area, and they were both wandering females in the fall. So, there's research out there that's documented the movements of these things, and they'll go to roads and turn around. And, I think what really ties in with the prairie is kind of unknown at this point, and it would be a great thing for someone to figure out.
That's a good point about the expansiveness of some of those glades and the violet species, but also on glades, there maybe aren't as many nectar sources later in the summer. Maybe that has something to do with it. But like you say, there's still a lot we don't know. Just a couple last questions about planting violets at home. And again, if you probably wouldn't attract regals at home unless maybe you live right next to a prairie, but certainly violets will help the great spangled fritillary. And I guess, Chris, also, do the Diana fritillaries feed on do the larvae feed on the violet?
Yes, they do. Yeah, we don't have Dianas in Missouri any longer, although that could be changed. But yeah, Diana relies on violets as well.
So if we want to conserve regals, we absolutely have to save every remnant prairie that we possibly can and manage it well. And that is work that the Missouri Prairie Foundation really focuses on. And we invite everyone to learn more about the Missouri Prairie Foundation prairies that we own and manage. You can go to moprairie.org and where we work to learn about each of our prairies. They are open to all at any time to visit on foot. Any last comments that any of the 3 of you would like to make before we close? Well, thank you so very much. And we will be back on July 6th with another webinar, this time a Grow Native webinar on a homeowner who transformed her yard of invasives into natives. So please join us. We also have an opportunity now for everyone to symbolically adopt the Regal Fritillary. With a donation to the Missouri Prairie Foundation, you will receive as a thank you a card with a beautiful original artwork of a Regal Fritillary butterfly and a magnet, and you can learn more about that on our website. So thank you very much, Dan, Chris, and Steve, for your tremendous dedication to this remarkable animal, and your expertise and hard work are really inspiring. And thank you also for your time in presenting and preparing your presentations today. We are very grateful, and there are many, many accolades to you in the chat. So all of you have a wonderful evening. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.